Hey everyone, welcome back to Playing Close Faith. I'm Nick, and I'm really glad you're here. And over the last several episodes, we've been talking about grace, what it means to receive it, to live from it, to extend it, and what happens when grace begins shaping the way we build relationships and community. But eventually, grace also begins to affect something else, the way we think about purpose, calling, productivity, the pressure to make our lives matter. And honestly, this is where a lot of people become exhausted because modern culture constantly pushes us towards achievement, towards visibility, towards proving ourselves. We're told to maximize everything: our time, our influence, our potential. And after a while, it becomes very easy to tie our identity to what we accomplish, how productive we are, to whether we feel successful, useful, or important. And that pressure doesn't disappear spiritually. A lot of times, we carry it directly into our faith. We start feeling like we always need to be doing more, growing more, serving more, achieving more, as though purpose is something we constantly have to prove. And over time, calling can slowly shift from something meaningful into something heavy, something anxiety producing, something that makes us feel like we're constantly falling behind. And if we're honest, many people live there, quietly carrying the fear that they are wasting their life, missing their purpose, not doing enough, not becoming enough. And that fear can become exhausting because human nature naturally wants significance. We want our lives to matter. We want meaning. We want to know that who we are and what we do actually counts. And that desire itself is not wrong. But when purpose becomes tied to performance, peace becomes very difficult to sustain. And that's where this conversation matters. One of the clearest places we see this tension is in Luke 10. Jesus visits the home of two sisters, Martha and Mary. At first, the situation feels very ordinary. There are guests, responsibilities, things that need to get done. And Martha immediately moves into action, preparing, serving, managing everything. And honestly, most people understand Martha because she's trying to do something good. She's trying to serve well, be responsible, take care of what matters. But as the story unfolds, something deeper starts happening internal. And we see this in Luke 10, verse 40. But Martha was distracted with much serving. That word distracted is very important because Martha's problem is not that she's serving, it's that her service has become tangled with anxiety, pressure, expectation, and eventually frustration. She becomes so overwhelmed, in fact, that she turns to Jesus and says, Lord, do you not care that my sister has left me to serve alone? And honestly, that moment feels very human because underneath Martha's frustration is something deeper. The feeling that everything depends on her, that if she stops moving, things will fall apart. That value comes through usefulness, through productivity, through doing enough. And many people live here every day, always moving, always striving, always trying to stay ahead of the pressure, not because they're lazy, but because they're afraid of falling behind, afraid of wasting their life, afraid of not becoming who they're supposed to be. And eventually, purpose starts feeling heavy, not life giving, heavy. And then we see Jesus respond to Martha very gently in Luke 10, 41 and 42. Martha, Martha, you are anxious and troubled about many things, but one thing is necessary. Mary has chosen the good portion, which will not be taken away from her. And that response matters because Jesus is not condemning work. He's not condemning responsibility. He's not saying purpose is bad. He's addressing the anxiety underneath it, the pressure underneath it, the belief that worth must constantly be earned through activity. And honestly, that tension still exists today because modern life rarely rewards stillness. It rewards productivity, output, achievement, visibility. And after a while, it becomes easy to believe that your value is connected to how much you accomplish, even spiritually. People start feeling like they always need to be improving, always growing faster, always doing more, always becoming a better version of themselves. And while growth itself is good, constant striving can quietly distort the soul because eventually you stop living from purpose and start performing for worth. And that's exhausting, not just physically, but emotionally and spiritually. Because no matter how much you accomplish, there's always another goal, another expectation, another reason to feel behind. And underneath all of that is often a fear that if we stop moving, we might lose significance, lose our identity, lose our value. And that's where human nature naturally drifts towards proving ourselves, towards measuring ourselves, towards believing that our importance comes from what we produce. But Jesus gently redirects Martha back to something deeper: presence, relationship, attentiveness. Mary sits with Jesus, not because responsibility doesn't matter, but because relationship comes first. And that changes how purpose functions. Because now, purpose is no longer something we use to secure our identity. It becomes something that flows from identity. And that's a very different way to live. One person who wrote deeply about this was Dallas Willard. Willard often spoke about the difference between being spiritually busy and being spiritually formed. And one of his most well known observations was this: hurry is the great enemy of spiritual life in our day. End quote. This insight matters because hurry does more than exhaust us, it disconnects us from God, from ourselves, from other people, and eventually from the deeper meaning behind what we're doing. Because when life becomes driven entirely by pressure, it becomes difficult to remain present, difficult to notice joy, difficult to rest, difficult to remember that our value was never supposed to come from constant productivity. And honestly, that may be one of the hardest things for modern people to accept: that you can have purpose without constantly trying to prove yourself, that your life can matter without living under relentless pressure. And that's where grace begins reshaping purpose itself, not removing purpose, but freeing it from anxiety, fear, and performance. And maybe that's the shift that many people need most: not the removal of purpose, but the removal of pressure. Because purpose was never meant to become a burden you carry alone. It was never meant to become a constant test of whether your life matters enough. And honestly, a lot of people quietly live that way, feeling like they are always behind, always late, always missing something, always trying to catch up to the version of themselves that they think they should already be. And eventually, life begins to feel less like something you're living and more like something you're trying to keep up with. But grace begins to interrupt that cycle, not by removing ambition and not by removing responsibility, but by changing where our identity comes from. Because when identity is rooted in performance, rest becomes difficult, stillness feels unproductive, and slowing down can even feel irresponsible. But when identity is rooted in grace, purpose becomes steadier, less frantic, less driven by the fear that your worth depends on constant achievement. And that doesn't mean you stop pursuing meaningful things. It doesn't mean you stop growing. It doesn't mean you stop caring deeply about your work, your calling, or your responsibilities. It means those things stop carrying the weight of your identity. And that changes how you live, because now you no longer need every movement to prove something or every moment to prove something. You no longer need every success to validate you. You no longer need constant productivity to feel valuable. And honestly, that kind of freedom is very rare, especially today, because modern culture thrives on urgency, comparison, visibility. People constantly feel pressure to optimize themselves, to maximize themselves, to turn every part of life into an achievement. And after a while, even rest starts feeling guilty. Silence feels uncomfortable. Presence feels inefficient. But grace keeps inviting us back into something deeper. Not passivity, peace. Not apathy, but steadiness. Not the absence of purpose, but freedom from turning purpose into performance. And honestly, some of the most meaningful people you will ever meet are not the people constantly trying to appear important. They are often the people who have learned how to be present, present with God, present with people, present in ordinary moments, because purpose is not only found in being visible in big, visible accomplishments. A lot of purpose is lived quietly in consistency, in faithfulness, in small acts of love, in conversations, in patience, in showing up. And those things matter far more than most people realize. One of the dangers of performance driven living is that it can make us overlook the ordinary parts of life where meaning actually grows. Because we become so focused on doing something impressive that we stop notice the significance of simply being faithful. And scripture repeatedly points us back towards faithfulness, not constant visibility, not constant achievement, faithfulness. And over time, that creates a very different kind of life, one less controlled by anxiety, less controlled by comparison, less controlled by the fear of falling behind, and more grounded in trust, in presence, in grace. And so, as we close, here's a simple challenge for you this week: pay attention to what's driving you, not just externally, but internally. What makes you feel valuable? What makes you feel behind? What makes you feel anxious? when you slow down. And ask yourself honestly, has purpose become something I'm living from or something I'm constantly trying to prove? Because grace invites us into a very different way of living, one where purpose still matters, but pressure no longer controls us. One where faithfulness matters more than performance, and one where your identity is not built on how much you accomplish, but on something far more stable, something that grace has already given you. And in the next episode, we're going to continue this conversation because once purpose is freed from performance, it changes how we think about success, failure, and what a meaningful life actually looks like. So, next week, we'll talk about how grace reshapes the way we define success itself. Thank you for walking with me on Plainclothes Faith. No hype, no shortcuts, just faithful steps, one day at a time.